All right guys, so now that I've got this thing set up for using as a truck for hauling and towing, now it's time to move on to the next phase, which is to make it a little bit more of a Jeep. So because I am going to use this as a truck, I use all my trucks as trucks, you guys know that. I don't want to raise the center of gravity a lot. I want to kind of keep it mild because with a truck, the higher you jack it up, the worse your performance becomes when it's time to actually do truck stuff with it. So I'm going to keep it kind of mild, but we are going to raise it up just a little bit, put a nicer tire on it, give it a little more ground clearance, and just generally make it look better and perform a little bit better off-road as well. So let me show you what I'm going to roll with. So it's pretty windy out here. Hopefully the audio comes through okay. So over the years, I've done a lot of Jeeps, a lot of trucks, Toyotas, you know, the whole 9 yards, Nissans, everything else. So what I've basically experienced is that if you're gonna go with a mild lift, okay, so I'm talking like below 3 inches, then these spacer lifts are the way to go, particularly on the Jeep vehicles. And the reason why, well, there's lots of reasons why. One of them being that it's inexpensive. Number two, you can maintain your factory ride quality when you do this. And that plays off of number three, or number three plays off of number two, I guess I should say, which is that since you are using your factory coils, you're maintaining that factory quality, because you're not going to find anything higher quality or more well engineered as far as spring rate for the vehicle than the factory stuff. And then number four being that when you use spacers, you know exactly how much lift you're going to get ahead of time. So if you're trying to dial it in, you know, you can take some simple measurements front to back and know exactly what you want, and then you just simply order the spacers that you need to achieve it. Whereas with a coil spring lift, lots of times it's just guesswork. You're just putting it on there hoping that it ends up where you want it to be. So there's lots of reasons to go with a coil spring lift, a spacer lift instead of a coil spring lift if you're gonna keep it mild. Now, if you're gonna go above 3 inches of lift, at that point, it's a good idea to get a full-blown lift kit with new coils and control arms and track bars and the whole 9 yards. It's just gonna give you better performance because of the way the geometry and everything works out at that point. But I'm going under 3 inches. I'm gonna stick with about a 2-inch lift. And so I'm gonna use these Daystar Spacers. There's lots of different brands out there. I like the Daystar stuff. I like the material they use and the various options for sizes that they've got. So these are 3/4 of an inch for the rear. If you want, you can stack them and get whatever you want to dial it in, but I'm just gonna put 3/4 of an inch on the rear. And then I've got these 1.5 inches for the front. Now the spacer itself is actually 2 inches, but what they're planning on is for you to take the factory isolator out and replace it with this, so it nets you a total of 1.5 inches. I might stack them. That's what I did on my other Gladiator. I just stacked this with the factory isolator to get the full 2 inches. So I may do 2 inches front, 3/4 of an inch in the rear. And the reason for doing that is because obviously, as you know, all pickup trucks come from the factory with rake. So the rear is gonna sit higher than the front. They engineer that into them on purpose so that when you're hauling and towing and your rear end sags, it keeps the truck more level and your headlights aren't shining up in the air. So you do need a little bit of rake, but I'm gonna take some of this rake out and make it a little bit more level by lifting the front a little more than I lift the rear. So that's the purpose there. And then the other day you noticed that I did some measurements and found that my front axle is not centered from the factory. It's actually off centered from the factory. So after I lift it, it's gonna be even worse. So I went ahead and got an adjustable track bar for the front as well. Now this thing is the Steer Smart's Yeti Track Bar, and this thing is gigantic. It's bigger and beefier than I expected. The joints are nice and solid, and I mean, just look how big this stuff is. I mean, the camera's probably not doing it justice, but compared to the factory stuff, this is beef right here. And I like the way that it adjusts because it's got that collar in the center, very similar to how a factory setup would work. And so you can adjust this while it's on the vehicle, which I also like. So this will help me to be able to get the axle perfectly centered after I lift it. Now, I'm not going to bore you guys to death with installing all this stuff again. There's been a million different videos installing lifts on Jeeps, and I've even done some in the past on this channel myself. So I'm not going to go through all the steps and show you everything piece by piece again. But basically on these Jeeps, it's pretty simple if you have access to a car lift, which I happen to have this time. So hopefully it'll go pretty quick. So, I mean, it's basically what I'm going to do is just disconnect the sway bar and the shocks and then raise the truck up with the lift. At that point, the axle will droop out enough that you can take the coils out and pop the spacers in and go about your business. Now, the rear end obviously is really easy. The front end's a little bit more complicated because you do have a brake line that you got to disconnect, and of course I'm doing the track bar, which is going to take a little time, so it's a little bit more complicated, but it's basically the same deal. Disconnect your sway, disconnect your shocks, and then the axle will droop out enough that you can do what you need to do. So, you know, it's not a big deal. If you're paying a shop to do this for you, don't let them overcharge you. I mean, obviously I'm not a professional mechanic, I'm just a shade tree mechanic, and you know, I can do this in a couple of hours. So a pro shop should be able to do this in an hour, 2 hours tops, all right? So don't let them overcharge you, but that's pretty much all there is to this point, this part of the build. I'm just gonna put a mild lift on here, and then we'll get to the tires as soon as the lift is on. Okay, so the Jeep's on the rack, getting ready to go up with it. I took some measurements from the center of the wheel to the lip of the fender right there. And there's actually about 2 inches of difference on this one. The max toe Gladiator that I had before had about 1.5 inches difference, but when I measure this one, it actually sits 2 inches taller in the rear. So I think what I'm going to do is stack the factory isolator in the front, which is a 1/2 inch, with that Daystar spacer, so I can get the full 2 inches up here in the front. And then I'll go ahead and put that 3/4 inch spacer back here just to give me a little bit of rake for my purposes. Just wanted to show you how beefy that Yeti Track Bar is. That thing is massive. It's a very solid piece. I drove the Jeep down the road. It feels really good. But this was really nice being able to adjust it so easily while it's on the truck. And I was able to dial this front axle in perfectly and get it centered under the front end where it's supposed to be. So I like it. I like it a lot. Ah, there you go. I like that a lot better. Ended up doing 2 inches in the front and 3/4 of an inch in the rear. And it leveled it out absolutely perfectly. Now, obviously, it needs some tires. Oh yeah, that's more like it. Lots better. It actually looks like a Jeep now. So these are those Yokohamas that I've been sitting on for, gosh, a month or two. You guys picked these as the tire to review next on this channel. The XATs are built on the same carcass as these. This is the Geolandar MT G003. 295/70 R18, so just shy of 35 inches tall, or the equivalent of a 35-inch tall tire, and 1150 on the width instead of 1250. I think it just fits the Jeep better than a fat tire, and everybody knows that a slightly narrower tire is a little bit better for foul weather and some off-road conditions as well. So anyway, the Geolandar MTs, you know, they mounted them up for me, balanced them, they rolled really smooth down the road. Once I got above 70 miles an hour, just a little hint of a vibration, which is to be expected with an aggressive tire like this. As far as road noise goes, initial impressions are they are not the quietest mud tire I've ever run. That would probably be the Milestar Patagonia MT. Those things are whisper quiet when they're new, and they get a little noise in them as you rotate them over time. On the other end of the spectrum, you got some really noisy tires like the KM2s that I used to run and so forth and so on. These are probably on the lower end of the spectrum, but they're kind of in between. I mean, you can definitely hear them. They do hum. Definitely some road noise, but it's not terrible, at least not yet. After I get miles on them and start rotating them, that's when you usually will really be able to tell if a tire is going to be loud or not. But so far I like them. You can already see, I mean, I got one piece of gravel here from my driveway but overall they're not picking up rocks nearly as bad as an all-terrain tire, which is another thing I love about these. So time will tell. I'm going to do a long-term review on these in every condition imaginable, and time will tell how they do. But I think that for now they look fantastic on the Jeep. I decided to put them on the factory wheels to save some money, and I think it looks pretty good actually. A good mild build so far, and I'm pretty happy with it. It's always a project when you live out in the woods. So we've got another dead tree over here. I've cleaned out most of these along this new fence that I built down through there, but there's still this one in the corner, another big dead ash tree. And all it's gonna take is one good thunderstorm to blow it out of there and wipe out this brand new fence that we just put up several months ago. So just as a temporary solution, I had a couple of fence posts left over, and what I'm doing is I'm just setting them across the top here, and I'm just going to run a couple of nails in just to kind of keep the posts from rolling off. And the idea hopefully is that when the storms come and those branches start to break out of there, because it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when, hopefully they will hit this board or this post and it'll kind of break the fall a little bit and save the rest of the fence, especially my gate over there. It's just time consuming and aggravating to have to come back and re-mend a fence, especially a new fence. So like I said, these are leftover scraps. I'm just gonna lay this one right here across the top over there. We don't hardly ever go through this gate anyway. It's just kind of an access gate for when you do need it. We go back there maybe once a month just to do some weed eating back here anyway. And like I said, just a temporary solution. After this tree finally falls out of here one day, and once we get it on the ground, or if the top would just break out, then we could chainsaw the bottom down here. Anyway, once it's gone, then I can come back and remove these posts, but it might be a little bit of insurance. And it's a good excuse to use the forks on the tractor too.